Hi, thank you so much for coming to my online talk, and thank you for the organizers for continuing to have these online options. It's really useful for those of us that can't make it to every conference, as well as there are so many talks that couldn't make it to every single one in person. And also thank you to the organizers, in particular Jimena Bernal, for organizing the in-person part. It was such an undertaking to organize this all, but it was so lovely to see everyone in person. All right, I'll start by introducing this concept of multisensory stimuli in communication by highlighting the fact that we humans use multisensory stimuli in our communication all of the time. Things like my hand gestures can help me communicate my ideas, as well as the visual of my lips moving can actually help with communication, something that I think we're all a little bit more aware of now after seeing that with a mask. It can be a lot harder to understand someone, not just because of the actual masking of the auditory signal, but also because of the lack of these visual cues. This is part of the broader phenomenon called the cocktail party effect, which is basically describing the phenomenon that in a large, cocktail party of lots of people talking all around you, you're still able to have a conversation with one person. And that part of that is, selective attention, all sorts of different kinds of processes, but that's aided by the use of these multisensory cues. Now, it's not just humans, of course, that use multisensory cues. This is common in a lot of different species, and people have been working a lot in a lot of really cool systems to start to understand how receivers are perceiving this, all of these different kinds of sensory stimuli at once and creating this kind of unified percept. When I think back to the cocktail party, this is not necessarily the idea that you're creating this unique unified percept of all of these different stimuli together, but in fact, you're actually able to find this effect where the perception in one modality is improved by stimulation in another. Now, this hasn't been studied quite as extensively as some of the other concepts in multisensory communication, but have been a few studies, including some really pioneering work that was done in cats, where they have this visual detection task with these blinking lights in kind of the periphery. And they found that auditory cues could actually improve performance on the task, even though the task itself only required visual cues and actually was only a visual task. This has since been shown in other species, including humans, and with a very similar kind of test where the task is visual, but the auditory cues can improve performance. So we're considering this as a concept called cross-modal facilitation, the idea that the perception in one modality is facilitated by stimuli in a different modality. And like I said, it's not necessarily as extensively studied as other aspects of multisensory communication. And so we just really want to start to fill in some of these basic questions about this process. So what are the factors that are required that cause this to happen? What is the range of species that this is going to be occurring in? And what are the range of conditions that release this phenomenon? All right, so with that introduction, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit more. So I'm Logan James, and I'm a postdoc with Mike Ryan at UT Austin. And he has been studying this little species of frog, the Chungura frog, for decades. And it's become a really, really useful system for thinking about how natural, wild animals behave and react in response to all sorts of different kinds of stimulation. So Mike and now I have been studying the Chungura frogs at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute here in Panama, where I'm actually speaking to you from now after returning from Costa Rica. And this is a plentiful species in Gamboa. And so my first field season, I went out and I recorded a bunch of males calling. And so here's one of those. This is just a really tiny little frog, and you can see that he's, moving this air between his vocal sac and his body and his lungs to create this, whine. We call it sort of, almost like a laser gun. It doesn't sometimes always even sound like a natural call, but it's really a wonderful, wonderful little species of frog. And I'm sure that you could have noticed in that video that, there's the acoustic stimuli, of course, the call, which we know is the most important aspect for females when they're trying to find potential mates. But there's also that visual of that vocal sac, this really large amount of air that's moving back and forth between the vocal sac and the lungs. There's also the seismic stimulation that's coming from the ripples that are coming off of the body cavity because these frogs are calling in shallow ponds of water. So the first basic question we want to ask: do these all three of these cues matter. They've been studied in slightly different contexts and in the past, but never in this sort of in the way we can determine whether or not each of those three is impacting female choice. We use these robo-frogs that are developed on the right here, where we can blow air into this vocal sac to create that visual cue. And then we also have these little ripple generators that vibrate under the water to mimic the ripples that come off of the frog. We can release females in the starting platform in this pool. She can swim around and then make a choice by sticking next to one of the speakers playing a call. Now in this first test, we're going to have the exact same call coming from both speakers. So the task is not auditory. There's nothing about the auditory environment that can cue them on what to do. So instead, they were asking, do the females care about the visual or the seismic stimuli? And it turns out that they do, but only when they arrive together. So on the right here, we're seeing the results of this study where we have the percentage of frogs that are choosing the multimodal speakers, the speaker with the additional cues, compared to the bare speaker with no additional cues. And we can see that females are particularly responsive when the speaker is paired with both the auditory and both the visual and the ripple cue. So you can see here for this new experiment, we've added these green noise speakers that are going to play loud green noise that's going to potentially impact the auditory decision making. And we can see, so now that we know that these multisensory cues can be behaviorally relevant, we can ask whether they can cause this cross-modal facilitation effect. So now the task is going to be purely auditory. We're only going to be asking females to choose on an auditory basis between the two speakers. Everything else will be exactly the same. One speaker will be playing a whine, and the other will play a whine chuck. So you hear that little chuck at the end, which we call a complex call, and the females love that chuck. There again. And like I said, Mike has been studying this frog for decades, and so we can see in this graph here with year on the x-axis that females have been choosing the complex call with that chuck at about an 80 to 85% level for decades. So they really, really like that chuck. So the first thing we can do is just check that in this aquatic environment and slightly different setup, the females are still showing the typical preference for that chuck. And indeed they are. I find that about 80% of my females chose the complex call compared to the simple call. And I can put my little dot here on this graph as I extend it out into 2021 when I conducted these experiments. And indeed, we're seeing very consistent preferences. But now we can see that when I add that green noise in, the preference drops to 50-50. So now the females don't have a preference for that chuck anymore, likely because that masking noise is really just blocking her ability to tell where that chuck is coming from. But when I add that visual and seismic stimuli to both speakers in time with the call, we now see that she can find that chuck. So the additional cues are showing this cross-modal facilitation in the species of frog. And just to fill this in, if I add those visual and seismic stimuli without the green noise, we don't see a change in preference, likely because they're basically maxed out. Okay, so in response to with these data, we are seeing that the visual and the seismic stimuli together are rescuing an auditory preference in the presence of noise that normally is ablating that preference. We think that the temporal and spatial synchrony is really important for this. The fact that the visual cue and the seismic cue are coming at the same time and in the same location as the call is basically allowing the brain of these frogs to cue into where that chuck is coming from, whereas before they kind of just hear it and can't tell where it's coming from. And like I said in the introduction, this is sort of akin to these cocktail party effects that we see in human communication as well. And so now I can start to fill in some of those questions that I introduced at the beginning. With this first study that I'm doing, and I'm hoping to do many more, we now can see some of the factors that are required. So we think that the temporal and spatial synchrony of those cues is what's causing these effects. We can look into that and test that by, putting them asynchronously or in a different spatial location. And we don't expect to see the same kinds of effects, but you never know. We also now can add frogs to the range of species, and in particular, this adds a non-mammalian vertebrate, so it doesn't necessarily require, the the cortex that we think of in mammals as being particularly special, which is, not actually all that surprising at the end of the day. We also I want to just shout out my co-author, Leonie Bayer, who is working on the same exact stimuli in the bats that eat my frogs, and she's finding similar effects so far, so we'll stay tuned for that. And then finally, we can add into the range of conditions this sort of naturalistic decision-making in wild animals. In the past, these have been done with humans or with laboratory-bred animals, but now we're taking animals straight from the wild. We ask her to make a decision that's relatively standard for, her behavior of that day, and we see that she is showing these kinds of effects. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and thank everyone again for organizing all of this. It's been such a pleasure. I'd like to thank Mike, my supervisor, as well as my co-supervisors, Rachel Page, who's also my STRI host down here when I'm in Panama, and he's just wonderful, as well as Ryan Taylor and Kim Hunter, my amazing collaborators from Salisbury University in Maryland. There's some co-authors from this paper, as well as others who have been helpful. My contact is here. I'm super happy to take any questions or discuss any of this. And in particular, this is something that I think is happening or could happen in a lot of species. And I imagine if you have a system out there where you have, something that an animal likes in some particular domain, we can probably find a way to elicit this kinds of cross-modal facilitation effects to really try and kind of explore the range of possibilities. So if anyone's interested in those kinds of collaborations, I am, of course, super excited to do that. Thanks.